Okay, video 3 on my take on Buddhism. Where were we? I've done a lot of background just to give you a little bit up to speed with the more scientific interrogation into the sciences and what is left of the historical accounts, to put it that way, of the Buddha. And in the previous video, I talked about these different groups and the different interpretation systems. And we're seeing the same thing happening with the Buddhist teachings, even though, as I began, we have the monks that supposedly had carried on the oral teachings and were capable of reciting that. And again, we know that, I remember that from my university studies, I had a great teacher, who had studied both Assyrian text and Mesopotamian text and all sorts of ancient languages to be able to combine what he interpreted as the Old Testament. And he had personally himself encountered some of these people in some of the ancient cultures around the planet that are capable of remembering their ancestral history and all of the original teachings, which he said was quite amazing, because these stories, which we also see within Native Americans and all sorts of indigenous people, are to a large degree our cultural true history, even though that when we talk about, if we are talking about the Western culture, and this is a little bit sad, because when we talk about the Western culture, technically the original Celts, and I'm not talking about the Baal Celts that came from Mesopotamia and worked their way up through the Mediterranean area and crossed over Turkey and what have you, and ended up in Britain. I'm not talking about that group. They are Baals. And they are part of the makeup of Britain, and they are the engineers of Stonehenge and these kind of things. So these are not the Celts I'm talking about. I'm actually talking about the original Celts that lived in what we now see as Britain, on that island that were before the Ice Age, where technically Denmark and Britain and that whole northern territory were connected together beneath the ice. And then as the ice melted, first the landmass was shown. That was actually 15,000 years ago, so that was before the hijacking. But then the water level rose and divided the different countries into what we now know. So that's also part of the terraforming that the hijackers did on our planet, to divide it into smaller territories from where the colonizers could get access. So just putting that in the context as well. So when I refer to the Celts, they have more what we could call ancestry into the Cro-Magnon, the red-haired that are found in Africa, and they are part of, again, some of the Atlantean population and some of the lineages that were part of Atlantis long before the fall of Atlantis, and they are part of the fourth cycle races before the fall of Atlantis. So that's the Celts I technically refer to, the red-haired. Whereas the Bahals are the black-haired, which we also know the Mesopotamian people call themselves the black-haired, but that's again under the Baals, because when we look into the original Anunnaki and their lineages, they were more golden-haired. I know this is not what people know of, because this is so long before what we actually... So they are, in a way, the Niburian body, avian mammal body, is in many ways the forerunner of what we understand as the Nordic races, which is another sidetrack that I'm not going to go further down into. Okay, so... So we have the setup of the Buddha, which, in terms of, he left his royal lineage and he went out on a great journey searching for answers to these things that he found was conflicting. He was, of course, why was he born into nobility? I think that is a good question to ask ourselves, but that probably goes with the reptoid genetics. The reptoid genetics are typically on top of the royal lineages, as we also, the Baals are also reptoid mammals, but a different branch that comes from a different system, not the Syrian system, but just to put it into context, that gives the best jurisdictional rights inside this reality if you carry reptoid genetics, because that is technically the highest level, again, due to the Draco system inside our reality. So this has all to do with the reptoid hierarchy of powers. But because if you go with the priestly lineages, you have higher level of avian genetics, and they are not as highly placed within the hierarchy of the Old World Order. But they are more capable of working with energy, whereas the Rhabdoids are more capable of working with technology. Again, a difference that is important to remember. So we have this son that was born, and he got married. He did everything that he was supposed to within his royal lineage. And then he went out on a trip into town. This is how the story goes. And he saw all of this pain and suffering. He saw a sick person. He saw an old person. He saw emotional misery. He saw poverty. He saw all of these things that we are also seeing out in reality now. And one of again, when we talk about the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan approach to this, because the Dalai Lama is technically what we say is the last remnant of some of these teachings that are represented inside our reality. I remember an old podcast or interview that Dalai Lama did with one of these BBC interviewers. Can't remember his name, it's so long ago, and I'm not going to look it up. But he there talked about a daily exercise he did as part of his training, and that was to be able to contain the suffering of the world. He would sit down in deep meditation, which he has been taught since the age of 3. So this is beyond what most of us are capable of. And he would most likely have a very, very strong frontal lobe, which we know that Buddhist practitioners that have practiced true Buddhist meditation are capable of. They can go up up to 65 hertz of brain frequency, which is amazing, and it's all processed in the frontal lobes. So they have, when we talk about frontal lobe and limbic system and instinctual layer as in kind of a threefold division of the brain, technically you have the whole gray matter, so that's fourfold. And there are more different layers of the brain, but let's just do the 3 main areas where you have the instinctual level you develop until the age of 3, and then you begin to move into the limbic system, which gives the reason for the tantrums and the ego structure that is beginning to be developed there. And then later on in your teens, you shift from the limbic system and into the frontal lobes, where you then should be able to process the emotional information in a more mature fashion, where you actually learn what to ignite and what not to ignite, what to do and what not to do, when to control your emotions, when not to, how to verbalize your emotions, how to use your words and not just be emotional, instinctual, latching out in aggression, being more adequate in your behavior around other people, learning social skills, learning this is what culture demands of you, this is what society demands of you, the outer laws, followed by the inner laws, where you can say the limbic system is more connected to the 4th cycle, the frontal lobes are more connected to the 5th cycle, and the scientific level that goes with processing scientific information and using the entire gray matter or the cerebrum in a different manner than you're capable of if you're using the cerebrum from the limbic system or the instinctual layer. If you use the cerebrum from an instinctual layer, you get the perfect warrior that takes orders and execute things that are told, but you don't really have this emotional ability to figure out, is this actually, how is it to be in the other person's shoe? And if you have a person that has no limbic system, but only have frontal, as in kind of frontal lobe, large brain and instinctual layer, then you have some of the Asperger tendencies, because the limbic system is set out of motion, which means that there is not all of this interference with electrochemical processes and all the things that the limbic system is connected to. I talk about that in my whole classes, how that unfolds, just to give a short review here. And the 4th system is supposed to learn to control the instinctual layer. That is all the functions of the body. Technically, the cerebellum, the little brain, holds up to 80% of the processes of the brain, which is amazing. And that's what it takes to drive this physical form. And then the limbic system goes with your emotionality and what you see as your psyche. And then the frontal lobes is part of your ego construction and how you are able to observe yourself. And the Buddhists have gone into this whole observation of self. That is the limbic system and the instinctual layer. and using the Eightfold Path and these teaching systems to control that. Because what was it that the Buddha saw? What did he derive as he went through the different teaching systems of the gurus and within different settings? And he was becoming very skilled in their teachings, both the Brahims, the priestly, and the gurus. These are the practitioners of yoga. The question is, did he do Kundalini yoga that is tied to the chakra system? Probably not. We don't really know. He definitely has encounters with different deities that we know from Kala chakra is part of the chakra system. So there are these crossings where you could say, well, he might have come in contact with it, but he didn't take it into his type of teachings, perhaps because he was not going into the fourth cycle where the chakra system belongs, part of the Brahim races. That's the Aryan Shiva, first root race of the fifth, first sub race of the fifth root race, that were carrying on the teachings of the fourth cycle, but were to take it into the fifth. And he was supposed to be the next in line to push the Hindu or the Aryan Shivas into the fifth cycle, similarly as we see it with the Joshua mission that was supposed to take the third cycle that were prevailing the power situation in the Mediterranean area under the Baals at that time, and push it back into the fourth cycle and then move it from that one into the fifth cycle. So there was also purposes for that mission that was to take place there, which didn't go so well, as we know. Okay, so, and when we talk about what did the Buddha derive from this? And again, this is of course not me saying this is the truth, whatever. This is my interpretation of the purpose and the function of what he was doing, and then trying to see what he saw with his eyes, and my interpretation of it, of course. So if we're saying, okay, we're having a human that has a TD inserted that gives them access to high levels of information systems, including perhaps some of the ancient technologies under the White Elder Syrian races, including the understanding of what the fourth cycle were, whether it was a complete. We don't know if he had recallings of the original races of the fourth cycle before the fall of Atlantis. We don't know that. Or if you just got it as visuals, as in this is what is necessary in this time and this space. You don't need to know ancient history because that would put you in harm's way. So we're just putting you into what we can see here and engineer around you so you get the understanding of what your mission actually is all about. And the mission is all about that people at that time in India had got quite stuck in their fourth cycle deity worshipping ways, and everything were kind of, again, my interpretation, everything were kind of understood within the terms of karma. So if you were sick, or you were old, or you were poor, or things did not exactly go your way, well, then it's your own fault to shorten it down because it's more complex than that. But that would be the end solution due to the regression cycles, as I talk about as well, because you had administered what you had been given of features of talent, as it said in the Gospels, in a way that had led to that distortion that would lead to that outcome of the type of life that you were born into. Meaning that in the golden age of all civilizations, we had all of these features and possibilities, but due to wrongful use of energy and consciousness would fall down the ladder of the regression ladder, and with that, under the gods and the control of the gods, again, aliens, lose the potentials that you were born with, and eventually be exited out into what's called pralaya, where you would go in stasis until the next cycle, or the next Brahimic cycle, where Brahma again would breathe out new evolutionary cycles. And you can hear that I'm here putting in my context of information into the ancient teachings, which I don't feel is depriving them of their origin. It's just a little bit of updating them into what we could say is how we see things today. But again, when we talk about historical accounts, and if we look scientifically into and use the scientific method into the old teaching systems, I'm not supposed to do that. I'm supposed to see it strictly within the historical context of India at the time, and how we would see the Buddha as part of that context, and how he would interpret it with a 1,500-year or even more 2,500-year-old perception of reality compared to his psychological development, compared to the culture he was part of, compared to the time era he was part of, and how did they see this. And this will always, for those of us who are later in time looking back, will always be an interpretation from where we are, and we must be very careful with not conflating it and put in our personal interpretation of things, unless we can say to a certain degree, well, this is what others that are doing the same type of work also kind of agreed on, because we all kind of get a little bit of the same idea. So therefore we say, well, that's the standard model for interpreting these type of ancient texts and the historical context for it. But again, we can also say, well, that's a paradigm. That is what the Western world has agreed on is the right approach to interpret these ancient teachings. And it might be completely wrong, just because we are limited in our perception of things when we look into the ancient cultures of the Southern Hemisphere, does not make us entitled to say that that's the true approach. It just means that's our approach. It doesn't mean it's the correct approach. So again, this whole kind of, in many ways, to be able to go there, we should technically be born as part in an Indian body, and then go through the cellular memory and the timelines and things that are connected to that reality field itself to find the original traits of the original Buddhism. You technically have to go to the areas where the Buddha supposedly should have sojourned, and the Bodhi tree where he got his final level of information, whether it's actual or if it's symbolically representing the tree of life, which is where I kind of say that's interesting, because we have the same tree analogy both in Egyptian culture as well as in Mesopotamian culture as well as in Hebrew culture. But you can say Hebrew culture is part of Mesopotamia, so that goes without saying, and Mesopotamia and Egypt were talking together at the same time period, so perhaps they adapted a little bit from each other. So this is again the question we have when we talk about this. But we also know the Nordic cultures have that tree of life, the shamanistic, the indigenous people have also the tree of life, that is in Nordic culture called the Yggdrasil. So we are having these different representations of symbols. As Carl Gustav Jung also pointed out, there are definitely parts of our cultural history that are similar, which is why he came up with the whole idea of the collective subconscious that are carrying the witnesses and the story of our cultures as a part of a collective thought form, so to speak, which we can tap into, which he meant that were done in the work with the subconscious. And if we could get some of the archetypes to reveal that level of information, then we would tap into that collective field of the unknown knowledge of our culture. And these archetypes are very similar to the deities that the Kala chakra are also using when they are trying to activate the different levels of their chakra system. And we also see the same idea in the Kabbalistic tree, where we are having the different sephirot, that when you enter into a sephirot and learn to work with the area that it covers of powers and knowledge, you are also there working with an entity called angel. So we are having these archetype deities, angels that are way showers in these different levels of our inner work. And the question is again, are they part of the distortion programs, or are they actively what we call remains of entities, elementals from the racial grids? Are they fragments of our own higher levels of our consciousness, or is it part of the original construction holographic teaching system, or is it part of a cube technology? And all of these questions that we need to ask ourselves when we begin to dig into the deeper levels of understanding the scientific modalities, when we talk about both the otherworldly sciences as well as general sciences working within this field of trying to unravel the background information of what we're actively dealing with here. So again, the story of the Buddha and then the whole context around, so you get the different levels of understanding you need to work from. So one interpretation would be within general sciences and their paradigm, whether you are a Westerner or part of the original Indian culture, which I would have a tendency to put more weight into in their interpretation. But they could also have, as we're also seeing with the Jewish people, they are changing that now. But a long time when there was this whole scientific investigation of the Jewish Bible, then the historical account or the accounts in the Bible were taken historically correct, and they were trying to create timelines for that, which we're also seeing in some of the way that they are studying the Hebrew Bible in America, for instance. They are still having this religious overlay that excludes them from actually looking at these accounts as make-up accounts and not actual historical accounts. So this is where science get infused with religion, and then paradigms are built that are preserving ideas that are 2,000 years old, instead of actively going in and investigate, okay, is it a make-up story? What if it is a make-up story? Then what is the symbolic representation? What does it actually tells us? It is a story that is trying to show us elements of what it means to move from what we call the normal human conscious level, which could be Mitzrayim, and move beyond that into what we call the heavenly realms or the inner levels of knowledge, which goes with mysticism. And there is a high element of mysticism in the Gospels as well as in the Buddhist teachings, that goes from the exoteric outer environment into the inner environment of knowledge that comes with what we call enlightenment. So what sets us off is always this. We have that in the Mitzrayim story as well. They were slaves, they were miserable, they were hungry, they were poor, they were sick. We have that same element in the Buddhist teaching. So we can kind of say, well, living at that time period were probably not very fun, to put it mildly. It was a bit of a tough time. I do believe that the whole questions that he did, if you want my interpretation of that one, you probably don't, but I'm going to give you anyways. Why was it put into to observe? Okay, I come completely straight away from that the Dalai Lama exercise, because I needed to explain how he could do that. Let me finish that one off. The Dalai Lama, because of his enormously strong frontal lobes and all of the studies he have made, and his strong capacity of mindfulness, of being the observer and not getting completely absorbed into his meditation and what he's doing, have as part of his practice, or at least used to, as a practice where he would go into deep meditation, and then he would literally look at all of the misery in the entire world on all levels, from hunger and poverty and diseases and rape and disasters. And I've done the same exercise, by the way, because it's a good practice when we are to get our priorities straight, when we do this type of work to gain higher consciousness. It is important that we don't get trapped into our own comfort zone and our anxiety or fear of what is hurtful and painful, that we don't get trapped in our limbic system of what we can think we can cope with or not, in our immature, infantile state, where we can say, as children move from the instinctual layer into the limbic system, and if our parents had not been there as good mentors, we would have been overwhelmed by the enormous amount of cellular memories and inherited traits of our species, as well as subconscious memories from past lives and weird reactions to things that others were not reacting to because they didn't have the same past life history. And we can remember the past lives, but we're still influenced by it because it's part of our subconscious or our emotional field, as I talk about in the advanced work with the emotional field. And all of these 9 layers of our emotional field that are still part of our current configuration, but we don't have access to. So that's part of the clearing work to get through these 9 layers. And we're born with that. And the instinctual layer goes with the biology, but the limbic system goes with our emotional field, and the activation of this that begins at the age of 3, and the whole building up of our personality matrix or personality structure, and then activating the limbic system on the different layers subconsciously into creating that personality we have. That defines how we respond to outer events, what we are made up of. That's why 2 children in the same family can respond in a different way. Even though that they are born years apart, that would make a difference because parents are typically different at that time. But if they were twins, I've used that example before. So that's part of what is inherited, as well as the nurture, which is epigenetics. So we are talking about what we have born with us, because we're not born as blank slates, tabula rasa, that as John Locke proposed, we're not born as blank slates. On the contrary, we are born with all of the imprints that are carried in our emotional field, which karma technically is. And that is determining our current life and our physical constitution and what we're capable of, and the events that will play out in our life due to principle 4 that works with the law of reciprocity, that what you are energetically and genetically will be mirrored to you and reflected back from reality, which Jung also talked about, and he called it synchronicity instead. When you began to activate your subconscious, synchronicity would begin to come in play, because you are activating older layers of your emotional field, and by that older timelines, and by that older energies, which will then activate older levels of our reality field. And the shamans have been using different forms of DMT and what have you, and mushrooms and whatever, to get access to these deeper layers of the emotional field, to access the underworld, because that's what shamans do. They don't go to the heavens, they go to the underworld, and they use the tree of life to climb to the underworld and the 7 layers that are part of the underworld. Notice the emotional field has 9 layers, the underworld has 7 layers, and these 7 layers are connected on some of the layers, part of the emotional field, which is part of our subconscious. Okay, so I explained that in the whole transition science classes in details. So the work that the Buddha was set here to do was to get from the 4th cycle into the 5th cycle. And again, with the Dalai Lama completing that one. So if he would, jumping around here, very confusing. But this is how I do stuff, because as I said, my brain always goes down many avenues to explain the pattern I'm trying to reveal for you. So Dalai Lama, last piece of that information, he would sit in meditation, strongly observing the pain of the world, seeing it, envisioning it, tapping into it, doing a little bit of remote viewing, probably expanding his perception field into holding all of that misery. I've done the same exercise, as I said, and you can do that. And he would then suck it all into his heart field, where he would then transform it and then blast it out as compassion. And he would practice that daily, so that he would be able to contain and sit in the pain of the world without getting overwhelmed by it. And it's a very good exercise for those of us who really want to make a change in the world, that we are capable of containing all of that suffering without getting completely overwhelmed by it and go into a frenzy and a downward spiral of misery and pain, and that's too hard and that's horrible, and all of these conflicting emotions that are regarding this, because it is all of that. But if you truly want to change things, you can't let that afflict you in a way that blocks you from doing what you need to do. You need to find solutions, and to be able to find solutions, you need to see what's truly there, which is a mantra within Buddhism. See things as they truly are, learn to observe it, but not become part of it. Learn to administer it, know what to do with it. And this is where the Eightfold Path comes in, the different ways of working with the scanners and the different ways of working with the different levels of perception, from where you can anchor in the different understandings that will lead you to a deeper, coherent thought form of why that is. And with that, why that is within the system of Buddhism, you are then able to derive a kind of information system that will lead to enlightenment. So it's all about this energy pattern of perception levels that goes with the 5 scanners that have different levels of energies, that have different levels of features that you need to work with to get these different levels of understanding that will lead to different levels of enlightenment. That means leading to different levels of the original code sequences that goes with these 5 fields of the original reptoid mammal energy system, which is represented by the Buddha, which is also why even though we enjoy the philosophy and we can take a lot of the mental processes and adapt it into our type of psychology and our work in the Western world, We are still doing it in a different way, but mindfulness and the ability to observe and not be absorbed by our emotional features is definitely a lesson we can transfer from the Buddhist system and into the Western psychology, where we will learn to work with our body as an electrochemical system, which is the approach I have and is part of the whole transition science classes. And of course, I just made the overview sciences of it, and I would love to dig deeper into it and create what we could call pocket information within that system, where I can dig deeper into, okay, what is the subconscious? How is that actually made? And what is the levels of the subconscious in itself? What are the areas, the covers? How do we clear that one out? And these are some of the future work that I will embark on when I begin doing what we call the advanced psychology. I will there take the whole transition science classes, going from keeping the psyche's energy or the psyche's energy into the transformative energy system, and then put that into a new type of psychology, which I am looking forward to embark on, which follows the clearing, activation and clearing processes of the 2-8 pillars, which also goes into the understanding of the lineages and who is behind the different teaching systems, which is why I'm granted access to this level of information. So we completed the Dalai Lama, and we now need to go to the Buddha, and his interpretation and what he saw and what he got. And I will end this video here before we move into the next one. Thank you.